I'm going to talk about sleep apnea. As mentioned, the goal of our program of work is to develop new therapies, so I have some industry partners as listed here. Okay, so I'm going to talk about three things in this presentation. I'm going to describe the 4 key reasons why we think people get sleep apnea. I'm going to talk about some implications for therapy, and in particular targeted therapy, and I'll finish with some simplified tools to use in the clinic. So here are the 4 main reasons why we think people get sleep apnea now. Clearly you need some anatomical predisposition in the upper airway structures, but we now know much more about these non-anatomical traits as well, that being a low arousal threshold, unstable control of breathing, and poor upper airway muscle responsiveness, which I'll talk about. So this is the model that we think about now. And I think this summarizes it sort of quite nicely. So we can see on the left-hand side here, we've got an MRI image of a nice, wide, patent upper airway in this individual. And on the right, we've got a narrow, crowded airway. We can see the adipose tissue in the largest dilator muscle here, in genioglossus. And you might think, just by looking at this image, that this person on the right has sleep apnea, whereas this person does not. But it really all comes down to the interaction between your anatomy and those other non-anatomical traits that I mentioned. So in this case, the muscles. So my colleagues in Sydney developed this technique of MRI imaging, and it's called Mri Tagging. And as you can see, we can dynamically image the airway during the breathing cycle. And so if we went back and we just took a snapshot here and we looked at the static image, we might think, yes, they've got sleep apnea because the airway is crowded. But look here, this person, despite having a very narrow airway, is actually, and they're obese, they're able to compensate for that narrow airway by having fantastic upper airway dilator muscle responsiveness. And it turns out this translated during sleep, and they do not have sleep apnea. But we see all different types of patterns. So here's another pattern that we see. So we can see some dilation at the base of the tongue at the start of inspiration. But look what's happening to the uvula here. It's flapping back on the posterior wall here. So this is a very counterproductive motion in this person with moderately severe sleep apnea. And here's another example that we see again. Here's really no motion at all in a very crowded, narrow upper airway. Okay, so very briefly I'm going to run through the physiology here, the different reasons why people get sleep apnea. This is how we do it in the lab. As you can see, it's quite invasive. We've got fine wire electrodes into the upper airway dilator muscles, and the 2 that we really study a lot is tensor palatini and genioglossus. So we use this respiratory phenotyping technique. We've got a modified CPAP machine that enables us to really give sleep apnea to everyone who comes in the lab in a controlled way. And this is actually in a healthy individual here. So here we've got them breathing on 4 centimeters of water CPAP. We induce a transient reduction in airflow here. And essentially we've delivered a hypopnea here. You can see a mild reduction in airflow and increasing epiglottic pressure swings. We've got a sensor down the back of the airway. And the 4 things that we measure, as I mentioned, upper airway anatomy. And we do this by measuring the P-crit technique, which is essentially we're looking at the pressure at which the airway closes under these conditions. So we've reduced the muscle activity a bit by putting people on CPAP, and we look at breaths 3 to 5, and we work out what pressure the airway closes at. And as we can see in sleep apnea, we see a wide range of anatomical compromise. Here on the x-axis, we've got the mass pressure, so this pressure here, and on the y-axis, we've got the airflow response, the peak airflow in these flow-limited breaths. And here's 3 different individuals. So we're trying to work out where it crosses the x-axis. Here's someone whose airway closes at -4 centimeters of water, so really, only a mildly collapsible airway. Here's someone whose airway is closing at about atmospheric, and here's someone with very, very bad anatomy. Their airway is closing at +5 centimeters or more. The next trait is how well you can generate upper airway dilator muscle activity when you're asleep. So clearly when the airway is being challenged here, the goal is to try and recruit these dilator muscles to re-establish airflow. And what stimulates these muscles is a build-up in CO2 and these negative pressure swings in the airway. There's exquisitely sensitive reflexes that work very nicely awake and less so during sleep, but nonetheless, many people can actually recruit the muscles as shown here if you give them enough time. And the way we quantify that is really looking at the relationship between epiglottic pressure and peak activation of these muscles. And I'll just show you two examples. So here's someone who's got fantastic muscles. So we've lowered the airway holding pressure here, and we've really closed off the airway. No airflow at all, hardly, in those first couple of breaths. But look what happens. They're able to generate fantastic amounts of muscle activity very quickly, robustly, much like that person that we saw in the MRI image at the start. And they've very quickly reopened the airway, stabilized breathing, and don't have sleep apnea because they've got very good muscles, despite having a vulnerable airway. Here's the other extreme that we see. So here we've lowered the airway pressure, we've induced a reduction in airflow as shown here. The epiglottic pressure swings are increasing, and yet look at what's happening to the two upper airway dilator muscles, tensor palatini and genioglossus. Nothing really, and it's only when they have a brief awakening from sleep as shown here that you get that robust activation of dilators and reopen the airway. So that person, if they've got a narrow airway and they can't generate muscle activity whilst asleep, they're going to be in trouble. And here is what those two different scenarios look like. Here's someone with a flat muscle responsiveness, so despite increasing epiglottic pressure, they're unable to generate any muscle activity. Whereas the other extreme is the first example I showed you was a very steep slope or very, very good muscle responsiveness. The next trait is really how easily you wake up during sleep. Now, the reason we think this causes sleep apnea, and we think that the negative epiglottic pressure or negative esophageal pressure or effort to breathe, if you like, just before having an arousal is the stimulus for waking people up from these respiratory events during sleep. And the reason why this is a problem is if you're waking up all the time to very small pressure changes, you don't have enough time to naturally recover the muscles, as shown here. So if you're waking up at this level, there's really no activation of muscle. So that can limit the compensatory mechanisms. If you're waking up all the time, you can't get into deep sleep. And we know that slow wave sleep, for reasons that we don't fully understand, is much more stable from a breathing point of view. You tend not to have sleep apnea in slow wave sleep. And finally, it really feeds into this last trait, is how sensitive you are to CO2. So if you're waking up all the time, you're having big breaths, you're blowing off your CO2, and then that can feed into this last trait that we refer to as loop gain or unstable control of breathing. And really it's just your ventilator response to a disturbance. So here we're inducing a ventilator disturbance, a reduction in breathing, and we want to measure how much airflow response you've had in response to that reduction in breathing. And it turns out some people are just very sensitive to very small changes in CO2. They have excessive responses, and that can feed into this cycling pattern of unstable breathing. Okay, so let me just show you. So here's this, from a study we did where we took people with and without sleep apnea, and here's that peak crit measurement, the collapsibility of the airway. So we can see here that the red dots are the people with sleep apnea, and look at the range from -5 to +5. So there's a wide range in anatomical compromise in people with sleep apnea. If you have an airway that does not collapse within it, or you require more than -5 centimetres of water to collapse the airway, you don't have sleep apnea. So it doesn't matter about those other traits because you don't have a collapsible airway. The other extreme is also true. So if you're up here with +5 centimetres of water, you're invariably got very severe sleep apnea with 40 events per more an hour. But look at this overlap here. So if we take this group here, they're -2 to -5 centimetres of water. These individuals don't have sleep apnea. These individuals have mild, moderate, and severe for the same level of anatomical compromise. So it must be these other non-anatomical factors that are driving the severity of sleep apnea. So you should be able to give an intervention that will shift those non-anatomical issues and put them into the treated zone. Conversely, if you're up here with a really bad anatomy, probably just a non-anatomical intervention might give you a little bit of benefit, but it's not going to get the job done. You're going to need an anatomical and a non-anatomical intervention. So that's the sort of framework, very briefly, as to why we came up with these different traits. And it turns out 1/3 of people wake up too easily, 1/3 of people are too sensitive to CO2, and 1/3 of people have bad muscles. Everyone, as I showed you, has some degree of anatomical compromise, but it varies substantially with people with sleep apnea. And overall, it turns out 70% of people with sleep apnea have one or more of these non-anatomical problems that's also contributing to their sleep apnea. So that opens the door for these other therapies that I'll briefly talk about to finish. And this concept of a palm scale. So if we knew those 4 traits on an individual basis, we should be able to deliver targeted therapy. And it turns out, as I mentioned, in that 20% of patients have the same anatomical compromise as people without sleep apnea, and all of them have one or more non-anatomical problems that's driving their sleep apnea. So if we knew about how collapsible the airway is, as well as these non-anatomical traits, we should be able to deliver precision medicine here. As I mentioned, we should be able to target these non-anatomical traits in the 20% of people that only have a mild anatomical problem, whereas over here, you're going to need a major anatomical intervention, CPAP, and in between a combination of both potentially. So let me just give you a couple of examples in the time that we have, and I'm really going to focus on this work around pharmacotherapy for sleep apnea, because I think there's quite a lot of exciting activity in that area now. So we've got projects on all of these arms looking at targeted therapies, including all these non-CPAP therapies, but I'm just going to give you a couple of examples. So this is work out of Boston with our collaborators out of Boston. Luigi did this study, and basically we took Rich Horner's beautiful work out of Toronto, where he identified that the cholinergic system and the antimuscarinics are really important in the sleep-related reductions in upper airway muscle tone. Because if we could figure out what's driving those, at the end of the day, sleep apnea is a condition that's an interaction between anatomy and the muscles. So if we could, restore that loss of muscle tone, we should be able to treat sleep apnea. So in this study, we just took atomoxetine, which is a norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor, and oxybutynin, which is a broad-spectrum antimuscarinic. And you can see here it cranked up the muscles threefold. So that muscle responsiveness trait that I showed you before is really much better compared to placebo in this 15 or 16 participants. And that had a really quite a profound effect in reducing the sleep apnea severity when we gave them these 2 existing drugs, as shown here, and major improvements in both non-REM and REM AHI, as well as oxygenation. You haven't presented the oxygen data here, but really major improvements in ODI, nadir saturation, mean saturation. So that was quite exciting, and we've gone on to do other work. And this is one of my PhD students, Akia, and she's basically taken the same drug, atomoxetine, and we've looked at different antimuscarinics, because we're trying to work out maybe we could be more selective rather than oxybutynin. We would have perhaps a better side effect profile, and we're interested mechanistically. So we tried these 2 different antimuscarinics. One is more on the M2 and the other is the sort of more M2, M3 receptor subtypes. And it turned out that when we did that in these 10 individuals, we really didn't have any change in the AHI. So there was something about the oxybutynin that was quite unique. There was a bit of a shift with this particular antimuscarinic that towards less obstructive events and more hypopneas. And it turned out that, the oxygen got a little bit better. And with both agents, when we measured their alertness the next morning, they were both more alert. They were less sleepy in the morning. So even though it wasn't improving their sleep apnea, they felt better the next day. We've also done work with other NRIs. So we took reboxetine and another antimuscarinic as shown here. And what we found in this mechanistic study, Richard Lim was a PhD student in the lab, basically we could increase the activity of tensor palatini with this particular drug combination. And Richard's gone on to look at the AHI in people with sleep apnea and have found about a 40% improvement with this combination as well. So suggesting that this class of drugs is in fact having a substantial improvement in sleep disorder breathing. Okay, so very briefly I'll run through another line of investigation. So Dr. Crystal's overview very nicely, and I just want to echo those. We've been working in this area for the last 10 years in the context of sleep apnea, using different hypnotics based on that idea that a third of patients are actually waking up too easily. So if we could promote sleep with a sleep promotion aid, maybe we can stabilize breathing and treat their sleep apnea. And we've looked at many different of these agents. I'm just going to show you a couple here. This was the first one we did. We took ezopiclone or Lunesta, and we can see that we were able to increase the threshold for awakening by about 30% with that agent. So increase the arousal threshold, the respiratory arousal threshold, in this small double-blind randomized trial. And as it turned out, the people who woke up easily had about a 45% reduction in their AHI when we gave them this drug compared to placebo. So suggesting that indeed, if you can stabilize sleep in these people, you can fix their sleep disorder breathing, or at least improve it, I should say. So this led us to a variety of work. We've used trazodone, we've used benzodiazepines, we've done a 1-month trial. We've done a lot of things in this area now. And just to summarise it, this is Jane Carberry's work, a postdoc in my lab. And to our surprise, we were looking at different agents in this study, and we're very concerned that we didn't want to relax the upper airway muscles with these GABAergic agents. So we've been very carefully studying the upper airway muscles. And to our surprise, we found that this agent, Ambien or Zolpidem, not only did it increase the arousal threshold, it actually improved the muscle activity threefold, which was obviously a surprise to us. So we've gone on, we've done a little pilot study in the context of sleep apnea, quite major improvements in sleep efficiency with this drug, more so than any of the other hypnotics that we've studied. In the little pilot, we didn't see any improvements in AHI, but nonetheless, we were quite excited by a drug that could not only improve the threshold for arousal, but also potentially crank up the muscles. When we've just finished this, so this is Luigi's work, who also, Ludo's work, is a PhD student in the lab, and he spent some time in Boston as well. Again, we saw in this trial about a 10% improvement in, overall 10% increase in the sleep efficiency, but we did not see improvements in the AHI with this randomized trial. And we measured the muscle activity as well. And in this study, it didn't actually increase the muscle activity. Okay, so there's just a couple of examples. With the last couple of minutes I have, I'm going to just talk about, what if we could use combination therapy, put all these things together, and I'll show you a couple of examples here. So here's a study that Brad Edwards did, and these were just all comers. These were not selected patients. Gave oxygen therapy, and now that lowers your sensitivity to the CO2, so that reduces the loop gain instability problem, plus ezopiclone. And you can see the improvements in AHI that we had with that combination in these people. Many of people were, very much sort of in the treated zone, just giving them 2 non-anatomical interventions. Here's another line of work that we're doing in this grant that I have with our industry partner. Is Oventus has this sort of unique mandibular advancement splint that can not only pull the jaw forward, but it's got a pathway to allow oral breathing if necessary. And the big problem with these mandibular advancement splints is you've already failed CPAP. You need to spend a couple of $1,000s working with the dentist. It's a toss of a coin whether it's going to work or not. So what we did in this study is take people who were non-responders by definition here, and all we did is add this little valve to the end. We took advantage of this unique design and add a little expiratory valve to make it a little harder to breathe out. And when we did that, you can see that in these non-responders, we took many people down to the responder category. And then when we added a nasal valve as well, so delivering a bit of EPAP, many more people were responders. And now this is now a commercially available product as a result of this study. And so you can buy these little add-ons that might be an efficient combination therapy. So this is obviously targeting the two anatomical interventions. So ultimately, you might want to target several of these interventions to have therapeutic efficacy. So mandibular advancement splint and a bit of oxygen, depending on your specific problems. So really the concept is moving away from these AHI sort of treatment decisions that really don't get us very far to these tailored, phenotypic framework, if you like. Okay, so to finish, I'm just going to give a couple of examples of, we're doing a lot of work, as is the Boston group, to really simplify these tools down so that we can have tools that we can use in the clinic. All we did here, this is a Miles work during her PhD, another postdoc in the lab, is really turn off the CPAP for 5 breaths at a time during a standard clinical CPAP titration study. And what she found was that that lined up very well with the gold standard PCRIT technique, as shown in these receiver operating curves here. So that might be something that we can roll out on a large scale, just turning it off 5 or 10 times throughout the night. If you've got airflow, it suggests your airway is not too bad. If you don't, you can separate those people out. Finally, this is some work I'm really excited about. We've been doing work with machine learning to try and simplify this down. And it turns out, I won't go into the detail, but this is actually, and I don't expect you to be able to read this, but this is actually the internal workings of the algorithm. Usually with machine learning, you can't see the insides, but this is actually the clinical decision tree, so you can actually follow down the steps. And it turns out with pretty good accuracy, we can estimate each of the traits just using standard sleep study variables, 10 variables into this methodology. And we've since used this in a variety of studies now to predict mandibular advancement splint therapy and some of these pharmacotherapy treatment responses, and it's showing similar accuracy in the ability to predict responders. So that's we're following on with that line of work as well. So I might finish there and just thank my fantastic team. We're a large team down in Adelaide, and I'll leave it there and happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Danny. We have time for a couple of minutes for questions. Bill.
This might seem like a silly question, but for patients with upper respiratory tract muscle issues, are there exercises that can be used to strengthen or condition the muscles?
There is a bit of data that shows that, yes, indeed, you can train the muscles. So if Gerardo Lorenzo Filho out of Brazil has done some nice randomized trials working with speech pathologists to show that you can actually improve or lower the AHI doing some 3 months of targeted exercises for the upper airway muscles. We don't understand how that works, whether it's reducing the fat, changing the fiber arrangement, improving the endurance of the muscles. It certainly wouldn't be strength. We've done some studies to show the tongue's plenty strong in people with sleep apnea. But we're actually doing some work now. We've just got ethical approval to do some physiology to work out, do some training. I've just hired a speech pathologist to do some of that work more carefully in our lab. Yeah.
Okay, before we take the next question, can I have Lauren Azernow come up? There are seats reserved up in the front for the lightning talk speakers. So session 1 people, please come up because we're going to be zipping through on a very, very tight schedule. Yes, sir.
Yeah. So for your phenotyping, that work has been done for a while. What would be let's say, for this audience, the top 3 predictors for response for mandibular advancement devices, other than BMI, anatomic issues, and what are the characteristics, age, or so that you were looking?
Look, from a phenotypic point of view, the best you want to know their collapsibility of the airway, so you want to know their PCRIT, which we think we can now. That's number 1, and their loop gain seems to be.
Is there any correlation with age?
Look, very weak. Yeah, it's not a good correlation with PCRIT and age, but yes, the airway does get more collapsible as you age. Those variables in of themselves don't work well. You need to be more comprehensive in the way it's approached. Otherwise, you're still at a bit over a toss of a coin. So, yeah, I would want PCRIT and I'd want loop gain as the 2, but ultimately you want all 4.
So I have a question for both you and Andrew, because you both basically said the same thing. Andrew with respect to doxepin and you with respect to antimuscarinics, which is that we have drugs that work, but we probably have their mechanism of action at least partly wrong. How many drugs in that category do you think we're actually using in psychiatry and neurology? What fraction?
Like 99%. It's a lot of these things, as you know, clinically get used, and we don't really understand how they work. They have an effect, so they keep getting used. But yeah, look, some of the work that we've done tells us that they don't necessarily work in the way that we think they do, and certainly we've seen differences. Some of these agents are better at increasing sleep efficiency. None of them relax the muscles, I should say, in these people, and none of them made sleep apnea worse at a standard dose. And in fact, we've gone double the dose and haven't made people worse. So it's counterintuitive to what we thought, but we've carefully done the work now, and it's challenging our previous ideas. Yeah.